looking at Jacob for when. All right, so Chloe, will you please lead us together? We say Psalm 150 together. Chloe does the reading, little time of prayer. We say the Lord's Prayer together, and then conclude with the collect. And if those of you who are joining us could mute so that we're not stumbling over each other, that would be great. So, Chloe, please take it away.
Let's say together Psalm 150. Alleluia.
Praise God in His holy temple. Praise Him in the firmament of His power. Praise Him for His mighty acts. Praise Him for His excellent greatness. Praise Him with the blast of the ram's horn. Praise Him with lyre and harp. Praise Him with timbrel and dance. Praise Him with strings and pipe. Praise Him with resounding cymbals. Praise Him with loud clanging cymbals. Let everything that has breath praise the Lord. Hallelujah.
My friends, if anyone is detected in a transgression, you who have received the Spirit should restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. Take care that you yourselves are not tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Pray for Jake.
Oh, Gorbachev.
Mm-hmm.
Pray for those suffering in the floods in Pakistan. Our Father, who art in heaven,
hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Lord Jesus, stay with us, for evening is at hand and the day is past. Be our companion in the way. Kindle our hearts and awaken hope, that we may know you as you are revealed in the Scripture and in the breaking of bread. Grant this for the sake of your love. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Chloe. And again, thank you and welcome to everybody. This is, once again, a really great crew, and looking forward to exploring Kierkegaard with each of you. This is the third of 3 series of classes that I'm teaching this year that I'm calling either Archangels a Little Damaged or Learning to Love with these 3 modern Christians. And the first one was on Coleridge, the second one was on Dostoevsky, and now this third one is on Kierkegaard. But it's not at all expected that you did either of the others two to do this one. They're each separate, and each of them has a theme of love. How can they teach us to love? And I'll say another word about that in a minute. But I first wanted to very quickly, remembering that people are going to be looking at a recording of this, very quickly just go around and say your name and whether or not you've taken one of these classes this year, and then whether or not you've ever read Kierkegaard before. So I'm Christopher Martin. I've taught all 3 of them, so I have. And I read Kierkegaard in college, and then not that much until about 7 years ago, 6-7 years ago, when I started reading him again. And now I'm deeply engaged with him. I find him fascinating, and I anticipate that I'll be reading him for the foreseeable future. Joan.
Okay, I'm Joan Adams, and I have taken both of the classes previously, and I have not read Kierkegaard previously. I'm here because of the love aspect of it, and I'm just, happy to be here and love both of the other classes that I attended.
Thank you, Joan.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm Chloe, and I have also attended the other 2 classes. Was somewhat intimidated by both of them. I've never read Kierkegaard before, and I'm intimidated by him already, even though I know nothing about him. So.
My name is Andre, and you have to forgive me. It's going to be Kierkegaard for me. That's how I teach him. That's how I pronounce it. I I can't just change it. Well, how about Mr. K? Well, yeah, I've been to Dostoevsky, and we did a nice job. I liked it a lot, so it was interesting to refresh Dostoevsky. Kierkegaard, I'm also intimidated by him, and kind of mixed feelings. Some of his stuff I liked very much, like Fear and Trembling, but his essay on friendship, for example, is totally lousy. So mixed feelings, depends on where we are in relation to Kierkegaard. Anyway, that's it. I read Kierkegaard, but still intimidated.
Good.
Okay.
Tanner.
Should we look into the camera? I'm Gold Star, Walt Tanner, and I'm Gold Star. I've been here for all the classes. And so you can all just say Gold Star. And Kierkegaard is incredibly influential, and we're all locked into saying his name the same way when those of us who have studied him. So he's just, I haven't actually read any Kierkegaard since it's been 20 years, and a lot changes in 20 years, so we'll see. I didn't like it that much. I didn't like his actual, I read Fear and Trembling and found it a little treacly, I thought. So I'm really excited about it. The thing is, he's so influential that, like, if you just read a lot of philosophy and theology, and you know people who are formed by him. So he's a giant. He's as big as Nietzsche, and he should be recognized as greater than Nietzsche, I think. But
Jill.
I'm Jill Holmes, and no, I'm new here, so I didn't take any of the preceding classes. And Kierkegaard is, well, years ago I glanced through Fear and Trembling, but the name is like always hovering out there somewhere, and so I'm happy to maybe get him landed if I can a little bit. So I'm looking forward to the class.
Great, thank you, Jill. Mike.
Hi, Mike Green. I have not read Kierkegaard. I've heard of him. I'm here because, like Joan said, I'm here for learning to love, and Christopher's great sales program to get me. I'm waiting for all the free stuff.
That's right, exactly. Let's go to Joan, and then we'll hit the screen.
Oh, hi, I'm Joan Corey, and I've taken the past 2 classes, which I've really enjoyed, and I have not read Kierkegaard, but I've heard of him so much. I think Christopher referred to him at one point, so I'm looking forward to hearing more about him.
Good. Carol, and you're on mute at the moment, so.
I'm Carol, and I went to the Dostoevsky class and had so much fun there, I thought I had to come back for this one. And I read Kierkegaard, whatever it is, in seminary, and it took me back to my strange fin de siècle days in high school, where everybody was rationalizing about why they could not love. And I really felt when I read Kierkegaard in seminary and read why he couldn't possibly get married, I did not buy his argument. So there's my relationship with him.
Good. Good. Jay.
I'm Jay. I have not been to any of the previous courses that we've had here. I heard your pitch during the Sunday services, and I haven't read Kierkegaard, so I decided that I would come because I'm always fascinated to hear an exposition on the good.
Excellent. Joe.
Hey, I have to ask what that library is behind you. Is that in Portugal?
It is a library. It is a library that is famous in Glasgow, that at this point is shut down, being renewed, and probably all of the books are in deep storage themselves being renewed.
Well, that's why I'm here, to see that library. My name's Joe Simmons.
Kierkegaard, by the way.
My name's Joe Simmons, and I'm actually a member of the Presbyterian Church in Nevada. I'm something of a church hopper, and I've met Christopher and very interested in learning what he has to say and how he teaches. And all the many years I spent in higher academia, I avoided philosophy like a plague. So I've not read Kierkegaard. My girlfriend, who taught at the university for years in literature, can't even help me much with it. But I'm here to learn more about it and meet you guys. So nice to be here.
Good. Thanks, Joe. Kathy.
I haven't been to the other classes. I encountered Kierkegaard coming from a perspective of French absurdist drama and existentialism. And I can't say that I learned anything from Kierkegaard, but I'm open.
All right, thanks. Joanne?
So I did part of the Dostoevsky class, and then I got COVID and was traveling, so wasn't able to complete it. But I come to this as a Danish girl, so very much interested in Kierkegaard as my kindred Danish spirit. Come from a Lutheran background, so often would hear sprinklings of Kierkegaard in sermons, but I have not read Kierkegaard myself, so this will be a chance to do that.
Good. Chris?
Hi, I'm Chris Tilley, and I'm really new to St. Paul's, and I just attended a couple masses, and I saw this, and I'm very interested in Kierkegaard. I've read a bit of him from time to time at different points in my life, and I'm just interested to learn. So.
Great, welcome. And last but certainly not least, Alex.
Hi everybody, I'm Alex Reynolds. Chris, I want your apartment. And gosh, I'm so glad to be here because I would do this just to hang out with you guys. I just love what everyone has said so far. It's so interesting, you know. I think I had some Kierkegaard in philosophy at college at Dominican. I remember I liked him. He seemed nicer, you know, and something I could relate to. So nothing specific. I also did the Dostoevsky, and I remembered enough smatterings of that. But I'm glad that I got to participate in that because you know, I have a feel for it, so I can, you know, enough knowledge to be dangerous. And thank God I don't drink, because then I would be really stupid.
Very good.
And Tanner, there's a Gold Star. There's a T-shirt at the end of the course.
We're all about the
Learn to love.
we're all about the merchandise now at St. Paul's. If you haven't grabbed your St. Paul's water bottle, please do.
The irresistible Learn to Love T-shirt.
Yeah, that's exactly.
I'll just say I'm irresistible.
Well, so the theme, or one of the themes from this class is Archangels a Little Damaged, or the series of classes is Archangels a Little Damaged, the other is Love. So I want to say a word about those two things before we turn our attention to Soren. So Archangel's a Little Damaged. We get that phrase from Coleridge's best friend, Charles Lamb, who was with him since they were in essentially primary school together. And throughout his whole life, Coleridge is an impossible friend, talks all the time, you hardly ever get a word in edgewise, opium addicted, really strange relationship with women, goes through all sorts of different torturous paths after a miraculous year of writing poetry, continues to write, have ideas, never quite gets synthesized. Well, late in his life, Lamb observes Coleridge reciting from memory some of his best poems, and he writes a letter, Lamb does, to Wordsworth, saying when he reads his poetry, he recovers his former glory. His eyes are so animated. He's like an archangel a little damaged. And that strikes me as right for all three of the men that we're considering. They are archangels. They are capable of delivering great messages of God and God's love for us that can I think are deeply stirring and moving. And they're all three really screwed up guys. So we're going to explore some of the ways in which Kierkegaard is screwed up tonight. But the point is to keep remembering that despite that, he still has a profound message for us. The other is that we are exploring love, and I've been inviting us to keep remembering a very simple stages of love that Bernard of Clairvaux first wrote in a letter to a community of Carthusian monks. And they loved it so much, they said, please tell us more, and he wrote a treatise on it, The Stages of Love. It's a beautiful, brief thing. But the stages are very simple. He says we all start off as loving ourselves for ourselves' sake, and that's appropriate. We breathe, we eat, we keep ourselves alive. Then, when we begin to discover who God is, we begin to love God for ourselves' sake. That, God is so good, God is so good, God is so good to me. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. That's the next stage. What I was suggesting was that with Coleridge and Dostoevsky, they could help us go to the third stage, which is loving God for God's sake. So it's a love that goes beyond ourselves. And with Coleridge, he invites us to do that particularly in his sometimes preternatural, almost supernatural relationship with creation, really seeing creation as God's language to us, just as words are his language to one another. God's language to us is through creation. So loving God through creation, God for God's sake through creation. And with Dostoevsky, we looked at kenosis, the self-emptying, service of neighbor, going beyond contempt to reverence, and then beyond reverence to taking responsibility. That's the third stage. However, and this is really intriguing, Bernard says that there's one stage beyond loving God for God's sake, and that is loving ourselves for God's sake. And that's where Kierkegaard is going to be helpful, and particularly the essay that we're going to be looking at, Purity of Heart, is to will one thing. What is it that one wills when one wills one thing? So we're going to be looking at that starting next week in this particular essay. The short answer is when we do God's will is when we love ourselves for God's sake. Now, that happens. Bernard of Clairvaux is in the 11th century. 2 centuries later, Dante writes the Divine Comedy. And in a moment in the Paradiso, he captures, I think, what Bernard is shooting after, and Kierkegaard is as well. So this is in the third part of the Paradiso. Dante has been taken beyond the earthly paradise, and he shoots up to the inside of the moon. And he discovers that the moon is sort of the outer rim of paradise. It's the lowest rank in paradise. He finds himself in a conversation with one of the faces that's inside the moon. It's Picarda is her name. And he asks a really obvious question. You're in the lowest rank. Does that ever bother you? Do you want to be in one of the higher ranks? Do you want to be over in the sun or in Saturn or one of those places that gets you closer? Where's your ambition? And Picarda's response, I think, is really quite beautiful. So here's Dante's question. But tell me, do you who are here content desire to achieve a higher place where you might see still more and make yourselves more dear? Along with the other shades, she smiled, then answered me with so much gladness, she seemed alight with love's first fire. Brother, the power of love subdues our will so that we long for only what we have and thirst for nothing else. If we desired to be more exalted, our desires would be discordant with his will, which assigns us to this place. That, as you will see, would not befit these circles if to be ruled by love is here required, and if you consider well the nature of that love. No, it is the very essence of this blessed state that we remain within the will of God, so that our wills combine in unity. Therefore, our rank from height to height throughout this kingdom pleases all the kingdom, as it delights the king who wills us to will his will. And in his will is our peace. It is to that sea all things move, both what his will creates and that which nature makes. And then Dante responds, then it was clear to me that everywhere in heaven is paradise, even if the grace of the highest good does not rain down in equal measure. So the most famous phrase from that is, in his will is our peace. And now Bernard, when he first came up with those 4 stages, he said, actually the 4th stage is, you can't really achieve that in this life. That happens only when you go to paradise. And that's true, because we're in a fallen state. But I would suggest that we can get glimpses of it, little tastes of it. And the essay that we're going to be reading from Kierkegaard is going to help us identify how we can be more frequently in God's will and be confident of that. We'll be looking at particularly the distractions and busyness of life that keep us from being focused on just that one thing in willing God's will. All right, so that's the general theme of, those are the themes. Archangels a little damaged, and growing in love, and in particularly starting to taste this loving ourselves for God's sake. Truly saying, thy will be done. And we're going to be guided by this Archangel a little damaged, Soren Kierkegaard. Soren Kierkegaard? How do you say his name? So that's the first thing I want to say. So when I took him in college, it was Soren Kierkegaard, and my teacher then has become the dean of all Kierkegaard studies, Gordon Marino. He was a postdoc at the time, and he said Soren Kierkegaard. So when I returned to Soren Kierkegaard 7 years ago, that's how I pronounced it. But I was in touch with this parishioner here, Jake Sherman, who teaches theology at CIIS and got his PhD at Cambridge, and it's Soren Kierkegaard there. And I was like, well, when did he become Kierkegaard? And he said, I don't know, that's how they say it there now. So I was like, all right, well, I guess it's Kierkegaard. So Chloe and I were at a chocolate sampling class, and the guy who was teaching about chocolate and how you make chocolate was a Danish grower of cocoa beans and a producer of chocolate. So at the end of talking about chocolate of the class, I went up to him and I said, all right, if I were to pronounce the name of the most famous Danish 19th century philosopher, how would I do it? And he said, and I can't do it for you. He definitely said Soren rather than Soren, and I'm having a hard time that. But his last name, it's like Kierkegaard.
Yeah.
It's something in the throat. There's definitely not a hard stop to it.
The Danish is
And if you've ever heard somebody say Danish, I mean, Kierkegaard is actually kind of closer to what this guy saying it sounds like than Kierkegaard. But honestly, I have to think about it every time I say Kierkegaard, because I'm just so in the habit of... So I think it's tomatoes, tomatoes. You can say it either way. So no need to be self-conscious about that. Now, Soren himself. I'm just going to hit some of the highlights of his life. I've included a chronology in the packet if you want to look at it. And I can point you in the direction of a couple of really good readable biographies if you want to know more about the guy. But he is born into a large family in Copenhagen. His dad was a peasant who became a very successful merchant. So he was born in one of the largest houses in Copenhagen, but from peasant stock. And his father married one of the servants in his household and produced multiple children. And Soren was, if not the last, he was the second to last of these multiple children. Three things to know about the father. He really was very, very rich, and such that he was able to subsidize Soren's education and lifestyle, and Soren made about zero money on all of his publications. He basically lived on the inheritance from his very wealthy father. His father was pietistic, so he wasn't just Lutheran. He was at the really pious end of it, very serious about his theology. And he and his young son Soren would have some very serious and intellectual discussions about theology and morality and all of this. But then, his father was convinced, despite being an incredibly pious man, that he was cursed. That he had, in fact, at one time blasphemed the Holy Spirit. The details are vague, but it clearly haunted Soren for his whole life. And we'll get to that a little bit more later. Extremely smart, witty, pain-in-the-butt kid. The Fork was his nickname in school because he would jab at, almost cruelly with great wit. And also, he had sort of a deformed back, an almost hunched back, so he was a peculiar sort of odd duck all along. But kind of the smartest guy in the class, but who wouldn't do the work and would show up. And so he eventually goes on to college, graduates summa cum laude, magna cum laude, goes on to do the equivalent of a PhD. In the midst of that, he meets a beautiful young girl when he's 22 years old, Regine Olsen, who is at the time 15 years old, falls in love with her. Several years later, as he's completing his PhD, he asks Regine to marry him, and she says yes. They're engaged for a year. She has a beautiful engagement ring. And as he's getting close to completing his PhD, he has these profound second thoughts that he cannot get married. It's not exactly clear why, but at least part of it is he thought that he was cursed and from a cursed family, and that if he were to enter into a relationship with her, he would be passing on the curse to her and their children, and he was not willing to do that. At the same time, he wanted to make it clear that this was all his fault, so he started acting as though he was a scandalous seducer, and acting really badly, so nobody would think that it was her fault, that it was all his fault. Now, what's really strange is that he stays in love with Regine throughout his whole life, and she retains a profound affection and love for him. She returns the engagement ring, which he turns into a cross, which he wears his whole life. When he produces his first book, Either Or, he produces 2 copies in vellum, so wrapped in leather, one for him and one for her. He makes her, at the end of his life, the keeper of his papers. She always had a profound affection for him. Later on, so she becomes engaged, married. They're in church once together, and a reading comes from the book of James, which was both of their favorite book, and they look at each other and share a smile. So it's a very strange relationship in drama. He breaks off the engagement. He takes a train to Berlin, where he goes to lectures by Schelling. Engels is there at these lectures by Schelling, and this is actually some of the people that Dostoevsky ends up in conversation with. This was a really famous series. Partly he goes because he has been bugged by the Hegelians. Hegelians have taken over academia the way wokeness has taken over academia now. Everybody's a Hegelian at this time. Everybody thinks that you can solve all problems by thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And that applies to everybody. And people are producing these tomes all based on Hegelian. Well, Schelling is one of these people who comes in and says, no, I can show otherwise. And Kierkegaard thinks he fails. So he starts writing himself and begins just pouring out writing. He returns to Copenhagen, where he does his writing, and he walks around. I'm going to wait just a second until these folks get back in.
Just think about Regina. Do you know where she's buried? In Kierkegaard's grave, on top of him. Interesting, isn't it? What crazy relation.
I know.
Hopefully the curse didn't fall over there.
Well, what did Hamlet say about Denmark? It's a cursed land. It's a cursed country.
Yeah. Well, here's an interesting. Oh, there we are.
Yeah.
So that we're back. So I paused as soon as we lost you guys, and we found out that Andre told us that Regine's remains are on top of Kierkegaard's remains in the graveyard in Copenhagen. And what I was about to share with you, in keeping with that, is Kierkegaard means churchyard in Danish. In other words, graveyard. So there's something kind of like just dark about this whole story.
Lovely last name.
Yeah. So
God's
where?
weird sense of humor.
Yeah. So Kierkegaard comes back, and he's completed his PhD. He also did seminary studies, but didn't quite get ordained. And it may have been sort of the same hesitation as with marrying Regine. I also think he really did feel a profound call to be a prolific writer. And he started living a lifestyle that would have been impossible for him to be a pastor, a husband, or a father, and keep up the productivity, because he starts writing at an astonishing clip. But he's also a very public dandy around Copenhagen. He's walking all the time. He's dressed up in finery. He goes to coffee houses. And then he starts publishing things, but he publishes them in two strands. He publishes 8 books under pseudonyms, and in the first one that he publishes, it's scandalous. It's called Either Or, and one of the portions of it is called The Seducer's Diary, which is often the thing that's assigned in college, because it's like a good little novel, and it tells the story pretty close of him pretending to seduce this, or seducing this woman and then breaking off an engagement. It's very close to autobiographical, but it's a scandalous little novel within it. But it's written under a pseudonym, so nobody's quite sure that Kierkegaard, in fact, wrote this. He wrote 8 things under these different pseudonyms, and that was a game that people were playing at that time. He also publishes 21 upbuilding discourses under his own name. He doesn't want people to know that he's writing so much, so he does things like he goes to the theater at intermission only so that everybody sees him there and thinks that he's there, and then he goes back to his room to write. He sets up his room so that he has multiple desks, and so that he's over here, he's working on an upbuilding discourse, over here it's Fear and Trembling, and over there it's Stages on Life's Way. And at the same time he's producing journals and papers and just an utter outpouring. So he writes for 4 years, and then in 1846 he decides, that's it, I'm not going to publish anymore. He publishes what he thinks is going to be his last work, called, and I'll tell you why in a little while, Concluding Unscientific Postscript to the Philosophical Fragments. That's the title of it. Say it again, please. Concluding Unscientific Postscript to the Philosophical Fragments. And I'll say more about that later because it's a big joke. And it's a big joke particularly on the Hegelians. And he outs himself at the end of this thing and makes it clear that, like, he's the guy who's been writing all of these things. And he thinks he's going to finally get ordained and go out and be a pastor out in the country. Or he thinks he's going to die because 2 of his siblings died at age 33. And there was somebody else who died at age 33. Do you remember?
JC.
Oh.
So part of it, I mean, this is a death-haunted guy. So he's wrapping up his writings, he thinks. And either he's going to die or retire. But then, when he outs himself and is outed as the author of all of these things, one of the publications that was popular at the time in Copenhagen starts making fun of him. And not only do they make fun of him in words, they also make fun of him with pictures. And so here is one particularly famous one. I'm not sure that you'll be able to see this. Jacob, will you be able to zoom in close enough so that, let me see. So there, you can see that there's a kind of a hunch. You see he's got the bad posture, and he's got the top hat, and he's got a little cane. And it's Soren as though he's the center of the world. So all these little things on the outside are everything else in the world. So he starts getting made fun of, and he can't stand it.
Because that's what the Hegelians got made fun of for.
Yeah.
So he's like, no.
It's coming back at him. It's coming back at him. So them's fighting words. So he starts to produce more and more things, scathing things about the state of culture and crowds of people being like herds and people not differentiating themselves, and it's all very petulant and dandyish. So this is one of those like not so great Kierkegaard moments. But he starts producing again, sometimes with pseudonyms, sometimes under his own name. What we're going to read is under his own name. And he continues to do that for a couple of more years. Then it turns out that one of his professors becomes the head bishop, Lutheran bishop, of Denmark. And Soren thinks, oh, this is great. You know, somebody who I'm sympathetic to and that will listen to me is finally in power. And he calls him to be honest about the faults of Christendom, of Lutheran Christianity in Denmark at the time. And when first this bishop, and then the next bishop after him, who was also a teacher and friend of Kierkegaard, refused to repent in the way that he thinks that they should repent, he spends the last of his money publishing his own series of magazines throughout what turns out to be the last year of his life, absolutely tearing down Christianity as it's practiced. He's convinced, he's like a prophet figure. And at this point, he's making everybody mad. He's refusing to go to church himself because he thinks it's so hypocritical. When he's dying, he won't even let his brother, who's a Lutheran pastor, come and give him communion. He only lets one friend of his, who's been a friend all along, come and talk to him. And because he's written all of these things that are pseudonymous, very often from people who don't claim to be Christians for one reason or another, there's a serious question like, are you Christian? Do you love Jesus? And his friend asks him this, and he smiles and says, yes, what else? And then when he dies, he has put on his gravesite a favorite Lutheran hymn that talks about, sweetly and sweetly I will talk with my Jesus. Mm-hmm. So he very clearly has this deep devotion to Jesus all the way to the hour of his death. But he's alienated from the church and from other Christians. When he is buried, survivors decide, well, he ought to be buried with a church service and in a church graveyard. But there are enough people who have read his critique that there is a minor riot of people who have been following his arguments. How dare you go against the practice of his whole last life? I mean, there's literally a riot. Then, after this, so hardly anybody's bought his books, and he's a scandalous figure, such that nobody is named Soren for the next 2 generations in Denmark. It's like naming your child Adolf in the 50s and 60s. Like you just wouldn't do it. It's only in the, so he dies 1855. It's only in the early part of the 20th century that people in Northern Europe begin to rediscover Kierkegaard. And then it's not until the late 1930s that he starts being published in English. And the interesting story here is that one of the primary people to discover him is Charles Williams, who not only was he head of publishing for Oxford, he was also one of the Inklings. So he hung out with J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, Owen Barfield. And he's the one who shepherds the first publication by Walter Swenson, I think, of translations of Kierkegaard. So this isn't until 1939 that people start reading him in English. In the 1950s, he becomes very popular because he's very influential for the people that become known as the existentialists. And he becomes known, he never uses the term, but he becomes known in some ways as the first existentialist. So people begin to read him. And then in the 1960s, there really starts to be a real industry around Kierkegaard. In 1967, a couple, Howard and Edna Hong, begin publishing the complete works of Kierkegaard, which now goes to, I think, 28 volumes. And I think it was finally completed in 1996, when I read concluding unscientific postscript to the philosophical fragments. As an undergraduate, I was still reading the Swenson translation from 1939, because that hadn't been translated yet under this series. But he's now huge. There are 2 places, the guy Gordon Marino, who was the postdoc who taught the class that I took as an undergraduate, he went on to become professor of philosophy at St. Olaf's College, which is the central place for Kierkegaard studies in the United States. They have a complete reproduction of Kierkegaard's library there, and you can go and see it. And I intend someday to take a pilgrimage and check this thing out.
Where is that?
St. Olaf's in Minnesota.
Minnesota.
That'd be great.
There's a huge, evidently, I've read, he's hugely popular in Japan.
Yeah.
People love to read him there. And he's also infiltrated even into popular culture. Gordon Marino was a boxer, and he befriended Mike Tyson, who has begun reading Kierkegaard because of his friendship with the guy who was my professor, Gordon Marino. Arcade Fire quotes him, Childish Gambino.
Seriously?
Yep, reads him, quotes him. For a while, evidently, there was a Twitter thing called Kierkegaardashian.
Oh yeah,
where
I
they put
followed
together
that.
quotes from Kierkegaard and quotes from Kim Kardashian, and evidently that's really funny and interesting. Just in the last few years, there have finally been two popular biographies of him. I just held up one of them by Backhouse. So he discovered, he had a friend who's like, I'm going on vacation, will you give me something to read about Kierkegaard? And he realized that there's no such thing. So he created something that was fun, has a light touch, is a good overview. So if you're intrigued and want to spend some time getting to know him, this is a good book. And then just last year, Claire Cavanaugh published a biography. It's a little more substantial than this. Very readable. It was reviewed, a multiple-page review by Louis Menand in the New Yorker. So he's out there and known, and continues to have an influence. But I want to read something from Backhouse because I think this is important to know. So why is he so famous and yet so difficult simultaneously?
What's Backhouse?
Backhouse is the name of the book, of the author of this book.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just going to quote a paragraph. It's a kind of a summary paragraph that I think is helpful for understanding who he is. Kierkegaard remains a perennial outsider. There's no church or school of Kierkegaard. See, I switched. No movement in his name. How could there be? His thoughts cannot be easily summarized and handed on whole. They scratch and fight and kick against the system, any system, even his own. Kierkegaard's thoughts need to be encountered one by one, person by person, or they are not encountered at all. His insistence on authentic existence is simply stated. It is the consequence of that existence that run amok. The infinite eternal God is standing before you now with greasy hair and a bit of fish in his beard, bidding you who are weary to come to him and he will give you rest. To turn away an offense from this person is natural, expected, even reasonable. Yet to turn towards such a one is to turn away from all that has a false claim on your identity, and into the one who defines what it is to exist. Family, nation, religion, and ideology are put in their place. It is easy to discover what gods any given established order worships. Simply find out what you are not allowed to put in their place. As long as people continue to live and move and have their being in habitual ideas of their own creation, Kierkegaard will continue to upbuild and provoke wherever he is encountered by the single one. Now let me unpack what you just heard by talking about his first authorship. Remember I told you he began this authorship with either or and then a series of upbuilding discourses. Every time he would publish one of his anonymous works in somebody else's name, he would publish these upbuilding discourses in his own name. His conception was that he was offering the upbuilding discourses with his strong hand and the pseudonymous things with his weak hand. His conception was that the strong hand things were the ones that were going to upbuild, that you were going to read them. And they're all direct and pretty wonderful commentaries on biblical verses. I've read them all. They're really good. The indirect ones were meant to come in as somebody pretending to be a Christian or not understanding what Christianity is. And he intended them to be read in a way that stripped away presumptions and left you in anxiety and uncertainty so that you could grab it again fresh for the first time. So again, he intended the upbuilding stuff with his strong hand and the indirect stuff with his weak hand. And he found that the audience went for the indirect stuff as though it was the strongest and paid little attention to the upbuilding stuff. part of what I'm trying to say is that he's always writing to both build up and to tear down. And you can't just do the upbuilding stuff without having the things that are in the way of your getting built up stripped away from you. And there's no shortcut of getting that stuff stripped away from you. You have to follow Kierkegaard and see, do I believe this? Do I don't? How does this make me feel? Oh my gosh, do I do that? This could be me. I think we'll see that ourselves once we start reading him next week. Again, then finally in the concluding postscript, he brings the two voices together and he thinks he's concluded it. But he doesn't. He keeps going. Okay, so that is his writing. And I think that gets us through essentially his legacy and his writings. I want to talk about just a couple of themes before we open it up for last questions. One is that his first upbuilding discourse that he wrote and published at the same time he published Either Or. So he's come back from Berlin, he's been a dandy, and he first begins to publish Either Or, pseudonymously, and then the first upbuilding discourses. His first upbuilding discourse, he writes to that single individual. And he meant Regine. And he knew that once it was published and she read it, she would know that he was thinking of her the whole time he was writing it. He then began to put for that single individual in front of every single one of his upbuilding discourses. And he discovered that when he was writing these upbuilding discourses, he was always writing to just one person. And that is you, Jill, or you, Andre, or me, Christopher. He always intends his writings, and particularly these upbuilding discourses, to only be read by a single individual. We'll see when we start next week that he begins with instructions like, you, my single reader, this is how I want you to read this. I want you to read this out loud. So we're going against his instructions by reading it out loud together. But I'm doing that in order to open the door for you so that you can see what he's doing and we can work it out together and you can get how he works, in the hopes that maybe you're going to want to take a next step and read him, perhaps aloud, for yourself. But the point is that he's never writing for the mob or the crowd. He's always going against that. He's always making you, me, he wants to challenge us to be our own authentic, we would now call it, self. And he understands what a difficult task this is. So, that single individual. The other is, I encourage you to read the page and a half essay that I include that talks about modernity, eternity, and paradox. Because I think if you start to get a sense of these three things, it will be helpful for you. So, modernity, part of the reason that I wanted to focus on Coleridge, Dostoevsky, and Kierkegaard is that all three of them are Christians who are writing either as modernity is just coming into being or in the first years of modernity, in a world that we still inhabit, when a lot of these things were brand new. So I want to say that when it comes to lived reality, modernity of most people, modernity begins in 1829. Why? Because I happened to go to the train museum in York where they have the first train that was ever built. And it was built in 1829. And it soon connected cities throughout England. And it was the cause for clocks in different villages to be synchronized for the first time. That's a radical change in our relationship to space and time that begin right at that time. And keeping with the train theme, it was after Kierkegaard dies, but in 1895, the legend has it that the Lumiere brothers in France had a 50-second film of a train pulling into a station in Les Ciotats, I think it's called, at an angle. And the first time people saw it, they were terrified and went against the back of the theater because it really seemed like the train was coming right at them. Can you imagine having that visual, seen that fresh and amazing. Like we get this stuff all the time now. So all of this is modernity that's just coming into being. So he's speaking at a time that's like our time. It has been written by Catherine Pickstock, one of my favorite philosophers. Modernity is the impoverished attempt to replace eternity with tomorrow. Replace eternity with tomorrow. So modernity is tone deaf to the reality of eternity. And yet eternity, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Part of what Kierkegaard is trying to get us to do is to become attuned to eternity and what eternity means. The reading this morning in the daily lectionary was from the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." That's pointing to eternity. Before Abraham was, I am. So it's beyond time. We speak sometimes, and I've done this, I bet Carol's done it too, where you talk about chronos time versus kairos time, clock time versus God time. And we have to intentionally rewire our brains to not be lockstep with modernity, to be able to hear the tune of eternity again. And Kierkegaard is going to help us do that. So, modernity, eternity, paradox. What Kierkegaard realizes, once you start to understand what eternity is, it is a paradox to live with eternity all the time. That can an eternal happiness, he asks, be built on historical knowledge? To believe in Jesus is to eternalize the historical and historicize the eternal. That's a paradox. To be following Jesus is to live in a paradoxical tension all the time. And so, actuality, here's what I say in the essay. Actuality for us as human beings is holding eternity and temporality together. Kierkegaard sees that this is comic and difficult. Humor, irony, anxiety, and indirection are among the tools he deploys to help us live this humorous, difficult, and paradoxical life. So that's what we're going to be set up to do. I've chosen a portion of purity of heart is to will one thing. What he says is if you want to have purity of heart and will one thing, you have to not be double-minded. And then he categorizes different kinds of double-mindedness. And we're going to look at the highest form of double-mindedness starting next week, to will the good only to a certain degree. And it's the kind of double-mindedness, he says, that we experience every day through busyness and distraction. So if he was saying that back in 1847 Copenhagen, imagine how much more busyness and distraction is true for those of us with cars and iPhones and more different TV channels and programs than we know what to do with. So what I'm suggesting is the 14 pages that we're going to read are incredibly relevant to what it's like to live in our own heads now. And he's going to be giving us some beautiful images to get around that. And then also, he's going to be pointing out some things that I think are going to hit really close to home, because they hit really close to home for me. So that's what we're going to start doing next week. Now, on the round tape, all of you who are on the Zoom call, I've already emailed you the PDF, but there's two PDFs there. Or there's a sheet in the PDF. The one sheet is an outline of the essay that we're going to read, where the portions that we're going to read are in bold, so you can see how it fits into the essay as a whole. And then there's the pages that we're going to be reading aloud. Feel free to take them home and read them if you like. You don't need to, because we're going to read them aloud together. If you're going to do some reviewing, just review the packet that I gave you tonight to sort of get your head in the Kierkegaard game, so that we can sort of play it together starting next week. So next week we're going to be meeting over at the table over there. We'll extend it a little bit, and we'll have a laptop, and we'll get you all in from Zoom if you can't be there in person. And as Michael Green can attest, we do this every Wednesday for Bible study. We do this sort of hybrid, and it works just fine. So we should be able to have discussion together as we read him aloud.
Christopher, briefly, could you explain one more time, millisecond, what exactly double-mindedness? Double-mindedness that you just talked about. What is it exactly? Existing in eternity and in time, or?
Purity of heart is to will one thing. The only thing worth willing is the good, and the good in truth. So anything that is not, at any moment, willing the good in truth is double-mindedness. Willing the good in truth and some money. Willing the good in truth and a little bit of respect. Willing the good in truth and popularity. Just a few examples. So what is it like to live seriously, thy will be done, fully, all the time?
This kind of schizophrenic existence that we in the society live in, totally schizophrenic existence, totally divided from ourselves, totally divided from God.
Yeah.
Alienated, using Marxian term.
Yeah. And it comes from James, who says, purify your hearts, you double-minded. And that's what it's reflecting on. James, again, you may remember, that was his favorite book of the Bible. All right, so I just gave you a big dump of information. Are there any other sort of questions or clarifications before we wrap up a little bit?
Yeah. Clarification on what we're supposed to do with the packet we picked up today.
I encourage you to go through it and read some of the paragraphs for yourself, particularly the 2-page essay that I have at the end about modernity, eternity, and paradox, to just prepare yourself for the reading so that you're oriented for next week.
But there's also 2 other things.
There's a 1-paragraph description of the essay itself. Here, I'll just walk you through. So it's got an outline for tonight's class, was page 1. Oops. Excuse me. There's always a bit of page shuffling here. So page 1 was the outline for tonight's class. Pages 2 and 3 were the chronology, so you could see for yourself when he was born and what he did and all that stuff. The paragraph that I read aloud about Kierkegaard being the perennial outsider is here, if you want to read that again.
Okay.
Then the portion of the Paradiso that I quoted about in his will is our peace, because I'm sure you didn't get all that was in there from my reading it once, but I wanted you to see that what Bernard of Clairvaux was shooting for was what Dante is shooting for, and what Kierkegaard is shooting for. They're all on the same team in different ways. They're all pursuing this loving self for God's sake, living truly like thy will be done, and with purity of heart. They're all hoping that we can shoot for that. The next page is, you'll notice perhaps on page 241, I circled purity. There's a paragraph that just summarizes the essay that we're going to be reading together. So if you want to get a sense of what the whole thing is about, there's that. And then finally, there's my little essay on modernity, eternity, and paradox.
Thank you.
What you'll be picking up on the way out is an outline of the entirety of the essay, and then the portions of the essay that we're going to be reading. And the outline has the portions that we're going to be reading in bold, so you can see what the flow of the essay is like and how the pieces that we're discussing fit into that whole. So, yeah. You know, again, like, I'm not sure that Kierkegaard likes what I'm doing here. You know? He wants you to go and read it for himself. But if one or two of you is inspired to keep reading him for yourself, then hopefully we can shake hands and make up. Not an easy thing to do with him, but in life. All right. Anything from folks? Yes. Yes, Carol.
Chris, I don't want you to even touch this question tonight. But as we move through the course, I would love to hear more about Kierkegaard's argument with the church.
Okay. Yeah.
question.
Alex.
Would it be worthwhile to get this book? The only English translation of Kierkegaard's book is part of the series of his complete work published by Princeton.
Yes, the problem is it's friggin' $45. So that's why, and I couldn't find, even though this is one of his most popular essays, and a lot of people say, like, this is the best first thing to read if you want to get introduced to him, this is the only version in English that I can find. And so, yet another, like, needless bounding.
I'm sure if you go to malls in Berkeley, you're going to
House?
find
Something different.
What's that?
Is that the back house or something different?
No, this is the actual book that we're reading. The back house you can get, it's in paperback now, and I think you can get this for like $12. And yeah, no, this is well worth getting. This is and affordable. And if you're going to be reading anything to accompany this, I recommend Kierkegaard, A Single Life. There it is, that word "single" again, because that really is sort of a theme. And it's very accessible, and it's recent, and it has brief descriptions of all of his writings. And
you might find it at the library.
What's that? And it's
You might find it at the library.
Yeah, you might find it in the library. I think I looked it up. There isn't much Kierkegaard in the Marin Library. I mean, like Fear and Trembling, but really Upbuilding Discourses in Various Spirits. I think they may have it over at Dominican, but they may not. I don't know if they have all 28 volumes.
There is a PDF of Purity of Heart is One Thing in the Brock translation that you can download.
Yeah.
And if you'd like, Christopher, I could email it to you, and you could make it available to anyone who wants it.
Thank you. Yes. Sure.
Okay.
That's a different translation than the one we'll be using. You said Brock translation?
It is, I'll get it for you. It is, yes, it was translated from the Danish, prepared with an essay by, published by Harper's in 1938. It was translated from the Danish and contains an introductory essay by Douglas V. Steer.
Perfect. And the fact that it was published in 1938 just reinforces this, nobody knew him until then. All right. Well, listen, the last note for the evening is a great big thank you for Jacob. This is the last one that he's going to be filming for us. He leaves for England on Tuesday. Yay. Jacob, bravo.
Yeah, thank you.
Bravo. I was telling Jacob that I went to share my lecture on Dostoevsky with some friends with whom I'd read Dostoevsky, and 28 people had watched the introductory Dostoevsky. So people are looking at it. So that's an encouraging and heartening thing. So thank you, Jacob, for the good work that you've done. Bon voyage.
Be careful, Jacob might join a union or something.
Good. All right, thank you all. We'll see you either in person or Zoom next week.
A little bit of technical job.
Thank you.
Can I ask, is there anybody who goes by the Loch Lomond area of town, by any chance?
That's me.
Okay, well, just ask.
Anybody's going to Novato? Driving to Novato? No.
Well, you'd like a ride home, is
Yeah,
what
I
you're
was just
asking.
wondering if anybody goes. But never mind, my daughter would be happy to come and pick me up. That's all.
Yeah, I'm going to stay for a little
Thank
while
you.
and clean up.
So. I noticed in English that Kierkegaard would say, well, opposites should be reconciled. Kierkegaard says, no, opposites cannot be reconciled.
Jill,
Yes.
I'm not going to Love Lost, but I can take you back.
Opposites cannot be reconciled.
Christopher's hanging out here, I've got my own car, so I'm happy to
Good job, sir.
I think I flunked the class.